What happens when a soldier returns from war only to find a battlefield waiting at home? Before we begin, let me ask, how are you? And how's your family doing? In times like these, when the world feels too heavy and too fast, I hope you're finding moments of peace. I hope you're holding on to those you love. Clara Whitmore wasn't seeking attention. At 50, retired from the U.S. Army, her medals stored in boxes and her uniform folded neatly in a drawer, she had every reason to keep her head down and live quietly. She had led soldiers through chaos, rescued the wounded from burning wreckage, and returned home with more scars than stories. All she asked for now was dignity. But war doesn't always stay on foreign soil. When Clara received a handwritten letter from Corporal Talia Brooks, a young black soldier assaulted by police during a traffic stop, something in her stirred. She had once promised never to leave a soldier behind. And now, one was calling for help not from Afghanistan, but from inside the American justice system. Clara didn't know that walking into that courtroom would mean walking into a trap. And she certainly didn't expect to face a loaded gun pointed not by an enemy abroad, but by a white officer sworn to protect the law. Retirement didn't come easy to Clara Whitmore. For most of her adult life, she had lived in deserts and deployment zones and command tents and battle briefings. Always alert, always responsible for lives that weren't her own. She rose through the ranks not because she demanded obedience, but because she inspired it. Her soldiers trusted her with their lives. Her enemies respected her resolve. The Army had been her home for over 30 years, but the medals they pinned to her chest didn't follow her into civilian life. In Baltimore, she was no longer General Whitmore, just Clara, just a black woman in America shopping for groceries, paying bills, blending into the background, and she was fine with that. She lived in a modest brownstone on a quiet street near Druid Hill Park. The house had no grand decor, just framed photographs of soldiers' shelves lined with books about leadership, and a flag in a shadow box folded the way they'd handed it to her when she retired. A place for peace, a place to breathe. Her daughter Celeste visited often, usually with folders under her arm phone pressed to her ear. A federal attorney with the Department of Justice, Celeste was sharp as a blade and twice as dangerous in court. She had her mother's fire, but none of her patience. And when she showed up on a rainy Thursday afternoon with a manila envelope and a grim face, Clara knew trouble had found its way back to their doorstep. Before you say anything, Celeste began, you should know this isn't a request. It's a warning. Clara, seated at her kitchen table, calmly sipped her tea. Go on. Celeste laid out the file. Inside were photographs. Police dashcam stills, medical reports, a folded letter handwritten in trembling cursive. The photo showed a black woman in uniform, Corporal Talia Brooks, slammed across a patrol car, face bruised, mouth bloodied. She's one of yours, Celeste said softly. Afghanistan 3 tours, Bronze Star, got pulled over 2 months ago in Montgomery County. They say it was a routine stop. Clara didn't move. They roughed her up because she asked for a supervisor, Celeste added. No charges were filed, but she's been transferred to base duty and told to stay quiet. And Clara asked, they're calling you to testify on her character. Publicly. Next week. Clara narrowed her eyes. Why me? Celeste hesitated, then slid the letter across the table. It was addressed in careful script. To General Whitmore. Clara opened it. Ma'am, I know you don't know me, but we served in the same sand under the same flag. I remember seeing you on base once. You told a group of us that we mattered, that we wouldn't be forgotten when we came home. I'm asking, please don't let them forget me now. Clara folded the letter slowly. Celeste leaned in. They're baiting you, hoping you'll speak out, maybe even lose your temper. They want a viral moment to discredit you. You walk into that courtroom, you're walking into a political trap. The prosecutor, Rachel Devlin, she's part of that crowd that calls women like us too emotional to be credible. And the Judge Edward Linton, he's got a long history of protecting bad cops. Clara nodded. I know, she said. Celeste frowned. Then why are you even considering it? Clara's gaze was steady. Because I promised I wouldn't leave anyone behind. That doesn't end at discharge. Mom, Celeste said, voice tight, this isn't Kandahar. These people aren't wearing uniforms. They wear robes, they wear smiles, and they'll destroy you the moment you show any real strength. I know, Clara said again. That night, Clara stood alone in her backyard beneath a gray sky. Rain tapped the leaves gently as she lit a candle at her small altar, a quiet ritual she kept for the soldiers who didn't come home. She closed her eyes, letting the silence wrap around her. She remembered the long nights in the field hospitals holding the hands of dying men who called for their mothers. She remembered carrying wounded Marines on her back through mortar fire. She remembered one young soldier, barely 18, asking if coming home would be worth it. And now here was Talia Brooks home, but still under attack. The following Monday, Clara walked into the courthouse, not in uniform, but in a simple black suit. Her head was high. Her steps were sure. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. She said nothing. Her silence wasn't passive. It was heavy, deliberate, a shield. Inside the courtroom was polished and professional. Judge Edward Linton presided with the indifference of a man who believed himself untouchable. Prosecutor Rachel Devlin looked like a magazine ad for corporate ambitions, sleek hair, icy smile. They were already sizing Clara up like she was prey. The trap had been laid. Clara took the witness stand. "Please state your name for the record," Devlin asked. "Clara Whitmore." "Occupation?" "Retired. Former Major General, United States Army." "And how do you know Corporal Talia Brooks?" "I don't personally, but I know her by service. I know what it means to wear that uniform and be told you're still a threat even when you've risked your life for this country." Devlin smiled faintly. "So you're here to offer a character reference despite never having served directly with her?" Clara leaned forward. "I'm here because someone has to stand up for her character since those sworn to protect her body failed to do so." The gallery stirred. Devlin continued trying to bait her. She asked questions meant to paint Clara as aggressive, emotional, out of line. She brought up past military controversies. She tried to question Clara's mental fitness post-deployment. Clara never blinked. And then, just as the tension thickened, it happened. A rustle, a shout, a figure in uniform. Officer Daniel Rourke stepped forward from the gallery. He moved quickly, too quickly. Gasps, screams. He drew a gun, raised it toward Clara's head. But Clara didn't duck, didn't cower. She stared him down with the calm of someone who had stared death in the eye before and refused to flinch. "I have faced Taliban guns," she said coldly. "I did not think I would have to face one in my hometown. From the so-called defenders of justice." Court officers tackled Rourke. The courtroom descended into chaos. Cameras caught it all every second. But Clara didn't move. Not even when it was over. By the time Clara stepped out of the courthouse, the world had already seen what happened. The video spread faster than any official statement ever could. In less than an hour, the footage of Officer Rourke pulling a weapon on her during sworn testimony had been shared on news sites, social media, and veteran message boards across the country. The moment she stood her ground, staring straight into the barrel of a gun, refusing to flinch, that clip became a national symbol of defiance. And Clara said nothing. She didn't hold a press conference. She didn't go on television. She didn't even answer her phone except for family. It was that silence, heavy, firm, dignified, that shook people more than shouting ever could. Her daughter Celeste, on the other hand, was not silent. Back at her DOJ office, Celeste was already deep into something she suspected from the beginning. This wasn't just one officer losing control. This was a coordinated attempt to humiliate and destabilize her mother on the stand. It wasn't long before the pieces began to fall into place. Celeste subpoenaed internal emails between prosecutor Rachel Devlin and Judge Edward Linton. What she found made her blood run cold. One message from Devlin read, "Let her talk. If she snaps, that's the story. We just need her to lose control. That's enough." Another from Linton, a strong black woman in a courtroom full of cameras. "Let's see how calm she stays when pressed." And then one from a private thread including Officer Rourke. "Make sure she's cornered. It won't take much to crack her. She's just another ticking time bomb." Celeste's hands trembled as she read the last one. It wasn't just a legal trap. It was a political one. They had planned to bait her mother into an emotional reaction so they could dismiss her as unstable. An angry black woman stereotype amplified on camera for public discredit. And if she didn't react, they'd had a backup plan. The gun, Clara hadn't cracked, but the system had. Celeste filed an immediate motion to have all communications between those parties entered into the court record. Within hours, the emails were leaked. The nation was already watching. Now they were enraged. Hashtags began trending: Stand with Clara, Disarm Courtrooms, Protect Black Women. Veterans across racial lines issued statements of support. One retired Marine colonel said on CNN that woman led troops under fire. She's the last person you try to intimidate with a courtroom stunt. Clara, however, remained in Baltimore, keeping her world small. She turned off her television. She stayed out of the spotlight. She focused on Talia Brooks, who was still shaken, still recovering. They met privately at a chapel near the base. No cameras, no press. Talia was young, barely 24, with scars hidden behind her calm voice. "I thought I was losing my mind," she whispered. "They told me not to speak. They said it'd ruin my career, that if I made trouble, no one would believe me." Clara didn't interrupt. "They treated me like I was the problem. Like I'd embarrassed the uniform." Clara finally spoke, voice low and steady. "You didn't embarrass the uniform. The uniform was embarrassed by them." Talia's hands trembled. "Why would they come after you?" Clara looked her in the eye. "Because I didn't stay in my lane." Later that day, Clara met with Celeste behind closed doors. The courthouse was under review. The judge had been suspended pending investigation. Devlin was facing disciplinary hearings. Officer Rourke was in federal custody. His gun, smuggled in through a security loophole, had become a turning point in court security debates. But Clara wasn't interested in taking a victory lap. "You know they'll come after you next," Celeste warned. "Whispers are already starting. People calling you unstable, saying you froze under pressure, that Rourke's gun jammed, and that's the only reason you're still alive." Clara said nothing at first. "I didn't freeze," she finally replied. "I assessed. I've been in ambushes before. When you panic, people die. When you breathe, people live." Celeste looked at her mother with admiration and fear. "You're becoming a threat to them now, a real one." "I always was," Clara said. "They just didn't expect me to bring the war home." The pressure didn't stop. Clara received threats, anonymous letters, strange phone calls. Her mailbox was vandalized, her tires slashed. One morning, someone threw a brick through her window with the words, "Stay quiet," written on it. She called no one. She swept the glass herself. That night, veterans gathered on her block without invitation. Marines, Airborne, Navy, Black, White, Latino. They took shifts sitting outside her home. Some brought folding chairs, some brought coffee. They didn't say much. They just watched. She stepped outside once and asked, "Why are you here?" One of them, an older man in an Army Ranger's cap, replied, "Because you were there for us. Now we're here for you." Across the country, ripple effects deepened. Several states proposed new legislation banning firearms in courtrooms unless carried by approved marshals. Activists demanded better psychological screening for officers allowed near civilians in court spaces. Law students wrote dissertations about Clara's case. High schools taught her testimony as part of civil discourse units. But not everyone was celebrating. Some called her a disruptor. Others said she was anti-police. A few conservative pundits accused her of orchestrating the incident for attention, even as her refusal to speak to the press contradicted their claims. Through it all, Clara remained still. In her home, a portrait of her unit hung over the fireplace. Below it, her folded uniform remained untouched. She didn't need to put it on again. She was still carrying the mission. Justice, she told Celeste one night, isn't a thing you chase like a headline. It's what you live like it matters, especially when no one else wants to. Celeste looked at her mother and said, "You know you're becoming a symbol." Clara shook her head. "I don't want to be a symbol." Celeste smiled. "That's exactly why you are." By the third week, the courthouse that once tried to swallow Clara Whitmore was under siege not by chaos, but by attention. Eyes were everywhere, from activists to inspectors, from retired generals to teenagers who had never cared about politics before. Everyone was watching, and something was cracking. Judge Edward Linton officially stepped down amid mounting pressure. Though the judicial board hadn't yet ruled on misconduct, public trust had already sentenced him. Prosecutor Rachel Devlin was placed on administrative leave after internal investigators discovered she had scrubbed prior complaints against Officer Rourke from the record complaints that, if left untouched, would have disqualified him from courtroom duty. Celeste, deep in the investigation, uncovered more. "Mom," she said one night, spreading out papers across Clara's table, "Rourke wasn't acting alone." She pointed to a string of digital messages, encrypted but decoded. He was part of a private messaging group, mostly former military and law enforcement, not just racist ideologues. They didn't just want to shut you up, they wanted a martyr. Clara scanned the transcripts. They weren't planning to just silence her testimony. They were hoping to provoke a national backlash, get her killed, blamed for her own death, and turn her into a cautionary tale. They thought they could control the narrative, Celeste said, that if you resisted, they could say, "See, she was unstable." And if you were killed, well, you'd be just another tragic incident swept under the carpet. But it had backfired. Instead of unraveling in fear or anger, Clara had stood her ground, and the silence that followed the steel trap calm the refusal to perform outrage had left them with nothing to twist. Every plan they had depended on you cracking, Celeste said. You didn't. And now the system didn't know what to do. Meanwhile, something remarkable began to happen outside Clara's walls. People weren't just marching, they were organizing. Lawyers offered free case reviews to veterans with unresolved police complaints. Soldiers, both active and retired, began to speak openly about harassment, racism, and intimidation they'd experienced back home. Churches organized witness circles to record interactions between police and civilians during hearings and public proceedings. Veteran associations called for the Justice Department to review courtroom security policies nationwide. The nation wasn't just watching anymore. It was moving. Clara, however, remained still. She continued her daily routine with the same precision she'd learned in the service, morning walk, tea letters, reflection. But behind her steadiness was a woman preparing for the moment that would come next. She knew they would try again. She just didn't know from where. One evening, Clara received a sealed package by certified mail, no return address. Inside was a flash drive. She hesitated, then plugged it into her laptop. What she saw made her hand freeze on the mouse. A video, grainy night vision, security footage from inside the courthouse, from 2 days before her testimony. It showed Officer Rourke pacing the back hallway outside the courtroom, waiting. He wasn't supposed to be in that section. He wasn't on the duty roster that day. And then another figure entered the frame. Judge Linton. They shook hands. Brief. Sharp. Then Linton handed Rourke what appeared to be a brown envelope. There was no audio, but the timing didn't lie. Clara played the clip 5 times before calling Celeste. She didn't use anger. She used order. Get this submitted. Chain of custody. Immediately. The video became the final crack in the wall. Within 48 hours, the Justice Department authorized a federal indictment against Judge Edward Linton for conspiracy and obstruction of justice. Rourke, already in custody, was hit with attempted murder and terrorism charges. More arrests followed 3 courthouse officers who had falsified logs to allow Rourke inside, 2 clerks who had doctored Rourke's file, 1 aide from the prosecutor's office who had lost a batch of emails flagged by whistleblowers. The silence was over, and Clara, who had never once held a press conference, never sat for an interview, became a national symbol not for what she said, but for what she refused to accept. In a moment when everyone expected anger, she chose presence. In a system that demanded her obedience, she gave them honesty. But perhaps the most significant shift came from a place Clara least expected within the military itself. A call came from the Pentagon. General Whitmore, the voice said, "We've reviewed your testimony and we'd like your input on a new advisory panel on veteran treatment, post-service, particularly regarding interaction with law enforcement. We believe your insight could lead to systemic reform." Clara paused. "Are you asking me for my opinion?" she asked dryly. A quiet chuckle. "Yes, ma'am, for once we are." She hung up the phone, sat down, and stared at her kitchen table. A few days later, she met Talia Brooks again. This time, they walked the garden trail behind the chapel. "You're stronger than you think," Clara told her. Talia shrugged. "I don't feel strong. I feel tired." Clara nodded. "That's how you know you're doing something right. You didn't let them erase you, and because of that, others are speaking too." Talia stopped beside a bench. "I heard there's going to be a bill. They're calling it the Whitmore Act." Clara grimaced. "I didn't ask for that." "I know," Talia said, "but we did." That night, Clara lit a candle for the first time in weeks. She placed it next to the letter from Taliatha, one that started it all. The script was fading now, but the words still burned bright. "Please don't let them forget me." She had answered that call. Not with vengeance, but with visibility. Not with rage, but with responsibility. And now the country had to answer too. The day of the federal inquiry hearing arrived like thunder, slow in the distance, but undeniable once it hit. Clara had been summoned not as a witness to Talia Brooks's assault, but as the key voice in a nationwide investigation into judicial corruption, courtroom security negligence, and coordinated state-level efforts to suppress testimony from minority veterans. The story had moved beyond Baltimore. Now the entire country was listening. The federal courthouse in Washington, D.C. was packed. Cameras lined the marble hallway, reporters whispering into microphones as Clara Whitmore exited her black sedan. She wore the same black suit she'd worn during the original trial, no medals, no flag pins. Her daughter Celeste walked beside her now appointed special counsel for the DOJ's Internal Reform Task Force. Inside, a special congressional committee had convened. Senators and representatives lined the long bench. There were cameras rolling this time official feeds broadcast nationwide. This hearing would be entered into the national record. A senator from Illinois opened the session. Today, we address not only a criminal plot to intimidate a federal witness, but the deeper issue how power is wielded against those who dare speak when the system expects them to remain silent. Clara was called forward. She stepped up to the microphone. Her voice did not tremble. "I am Clara Whitmore, retired Major General United States Army. I served 32 years. I commanded combat units in Iraq and Afghanistan. I've seen war. I've seen death. I've seen men good, men broken by the weight of doing the right thing in a world that rewards silence." She paused. "I never thought I'd come home and be asked to do it all over again." Flashes blinked from the cameras, but Clara didn't play to the crowd. Her eyes stayed on the committee. "I was asked to testify in defense of a young soldier named Talia Brooks. She had been assaulted during a traffic stop. She was not resisting. She was asking questions. And for that, they tried to make her disappear." She continued, voice measured. "I expected resistance. I expected bias. What I didn't expect was to face a weapon drawn in a courtroom inside a courthouse by an officer who wasn't even scheduled to be there. And I certainly didn't expect the people in charge of that courtroom to have been part of planning it." A senator leaned forward. "General Whitmore, when Officer Rourke drew his weapon on you, why didn't you react?" Clara met his gaze. "Because I've been trained not to move when someone wants you afraid. The first instinct in war is to survive. The first instinct in injustice is to disappear. I chose neither. I chose to stand." A murmur moved through the room. Another senator asked, "Were you aware of the emails sent between Prosecutor Devlin and Judge Linton in advance of your testimony?" Clara nodded. "Yes, my daughter uncovered them. They were attempting to provoke an emotional response from me so they could use it to invalidate my testimony and cast me as unstable." "Why do you think they assumed that would work?" Clara didn't hesitate. "Because I'm a black woman." The room fell silent. She continued. "Their entire plan depended on me being angry. That's the story they wanted to tell. Not facts, not military records, not honor. Anger, rage, something they could parade in front of cameras to prove that women like me are a threat, not a witness." Her voice hardened. What they didn't count on was me standing in the silence they created. A congresswoman from California asked, "What do you want us to take from this moment, General?" Clara looked straight ahead. "I want this hearing to matter more than the headlines. I want every young soldier, every black child, every person who's ever been told to sit down and shut up to know that standing still in truth can be louder than any scream." She paused, then added, "Dignity is the only weapon they can't take from you." A tear rolled down someone's cheek in the front row. It wasn't Clara's. After the committee recessed, Clara stepped outside to find something she hadn't expected. Crowds, not protesters, veterans, black, white, Latino, women in uniform, men with missing limbs, young National Guardsmen and old Tuskegee Airmen. They weren't chanting. They weren't carrying signs. They were standing, still, silent, like Clara had done. One by one, they began to salute. Clara stood at the steps and returned the gesture. The moment was captured in a photo that would circle the globe. Clara Whitmore, hand to her brow, the marble courthouse rising behind her, the flag at half-staff for the integrity the nation almost lost. The next day, the Clara Whitmore Act passed unanimously in the House. It banned all law enforcement personnel from carrying personal weapons into civilian courtrooms, federal, state, or local unless part of authorized security protocols reviewed by independent oversight. It also mandated third-party psychological evaluation for officers assigned to courtroom duty. No podiums were erected, no parades were thrown. Clara refused to be there for the signing. Instead, she visited the grave of Sergeant Malik Jameson, a soldier from her unit who had died in her arms overseas. She knelt, cleaned the headstone, and whispered, "We're still fighting Jamie, just on different soil." Back in Baltimore, a small monument had quietly gone up outside the original courthouse where it all happened. It wasn't tall, just a waist-high black stone, engraved with her words, "I do not fear the law. I fear the corruption that lies behind it." That evening, Clara stood before the stone. A group of school children were there on a field trip. One girl approached her, maybe 11 or 12. "My teacher told us you didn't even raise your voice," the girl said. Clara smiled gently. You don't have to shout when you're telling the truth." The girl thought for a moment, then asked, "Will they still try to hurt people?" Clara knelt so they were eye to eye. "Yes," she said, "but they'll have to do it in the open now, and that means we can fight back with truth, with dignity, and with each other." The girl nodded and Clara rose. In that moment, she wasn't just a general. She was a guardian of something deeper than any rank. She had not just defended one soldier. She had defended the soul of a country that had forgotten what justice was supposed to look like. And she'd done it without a weapon, only a spine made of steel and silence. In the weeks that followed the passage of the Clara Whitmore Act, life began to slow but not settle. There were no victory parades, no grand farewell tours. Clara didn't want them. The attention felt foreign to her, almost like wearing the wrong uniform. She'd never fought for recognition. She fought because someone had to. Because silence, she believed, is the ally of injustice. She returned to her home in Baltimore, her porch, unchanged, the quiet familiar. The flag out front remained at half-mast, not for her but for those who hadn't lived, to see the changes she helped bring. Every morning she swept her front steps and watered the plants by her door just like she always had. But the world around her was no longer the same. Courtrooms across the country underwent sweeping policy changes. Security officers now walked with badges, not guns. Independent evaluators began issuing psychological assessments of courthouse staff. The protocols were strict, reviewed quarterly, and most importantly, transparent. Judges who had once waved off internal reviews now sat quietly through public panels facing communities they'd ignored for decades. At the center of it all, Clara's name rarely came up, and that was exactly how she wanted it. The country had taken her story and made it something bigger than her. And Clara understood something the media rarely grasped. True leadership is knowing when to step forward and when to step back. Celeste, however, was not stepping back. Her appointment to the DOJ task force turned into a full-time role. She spent long hours drafting new language for civil procedure reforms, advocating for broader federal protections for military personnel in civilian legal systems. She traveled to states where justice was still more theory than reality. And everywhere she went, someone would eventually ask, "Are you Clara Whitmore's daughter?" At first, she'd smile and nod. But one day she responded, "No, I'm Celeste Whitmore, and I'm just getting started." Clara couldn't have been prouder. Meanwhile, Talia Brooks completed her treatment for PTSD and re-entered active duty in a non-combat leadership role. She didn't speak publicly about what happened, except to write a short essay that was later published in a national magazine. The piece was titled, "Home is Where the War Was." In it, she wrote, "General Whitmore didn't save me. She saw me, and after that, I knew I didn't have to disappear anymore." In the churches and schools of Baltimore, Clara's story began to be taught not as a legend, but as a lesson. Teachers used her testimony to explain civic courage. Veterans brought their kids to the small monument outside the courthouse and said she stood still and the world moved around her. Every week, someone would leave a new bouquet at the base of that stone, not because they were told to, because they needed to. In one town in Ohio, students painted a mural on a high school wall. It showed a black woman in a simple suit, her eyes calm, her hand raised not in anger, but in quiet command. At the top, the words, "Dignity is the only weapon they can't take away from you." When Clara saw a photo of it, she didn't cry. She just folded it, placed it in a drawer, and whispered, "Let that be enough." Still letters came, not from officials, from strangers. From mothers who'd lost sons to traffic stops, from veterans who had given up on being heard, from young girls trying to understand how to carry their voice into a world that tells them to shrink. One read, "Because of you, I didn't plead guilty. I stood up. They dropped the charges." Another, "My daughter was afraid to wear her ROTC uniform to school. Now she wears it with pride." And one hand written on notebook paper simply said, "You didn't yell, but I heard you." Clara read everyone. She answered very few, and yet her silence still did something louder than a speech ever could. One Sunday, she attended a veterans luncheon at the local armory. She wasn't on the program. She just showed up wearing a blue dress and a quiet smile. When the room noticed her, they didn't clap. They stood. Not because she was a celebrity, because she was a reminder of what duty meant, of what still needed to be done. A former Marine, now confined to a wheelchair, wheeled himself over and saluted her. "I don't have many heroes left," he said, "but you're one." She returned the salute. "Then make sure you tell your grandkids why," she said. And that's how she handled it all. No ceremony, no spotlight, Just legacy passed hand to hand like something sacred. The final honor came quietly. The president sent a personal invitation and offer to award her the nation's highest civilian medal. The White House made arrangements. The press drafted stories in anticipation, but Clara declined. She sent a letter instead. Thank you for the gesture, but please give that honor to the soldiers who have been forgotten in silence and shame. They earned it. I simply stood still. She never spoke of it again. Years later, after the news cycle had shifted and the headlines had faded, a young intern in the Department of Veterans Affairs found a photo of Clara on an old bulletin board. She turned to her supervisor and asked, "Who is this woman?" The supervisor smiled. "That's General Clara Whitmore," he said. "She's the reason the courthouse is quiet now. Not because no one's talking, because people are finally listening." And that was the curtain call. No grand ending, no encore. Just a woman who came home from war and refused to surrender to silence. Time moved on, but Clara Whitmore's silence never left the room. In the months after the federal inquiry, courthouse after courthouse across the nation began reviewing its internal policies. What was once assumed as business as usual was now called into question. For the first time in decades, local judges faced public oversight panels. Law schools added new courses on racial bias in judicial systems. Police academies across the country quietly revised their courtroom security training. And behind nearly every reform, every revision, there was Clara. Not in person, but in principle. In St. Louis, a black female judge issued a ruling and cited the People versus Rourke as a precedent, not for the crime, but for the courtroom's duty to protect all who testify. In Atlanta, a civil rights organization opened the Whitmore Justice Clinic dedicated to legal advocacy for veterans and active duty personnel of color. Even the Department of Defense responded. A new program was launched pairing military women with post-service legal mentors. The announcement came with little fanfare, but those on the inside knew the truth. It was Clara's shadow on the policy. And yet Clara kept her distance from the spotlight. Back in Baltimore, her life was simple. She continued to volunteer quietly at a local community center on weekends, tutoring young veterans in resume writing and leadership skills. She showed up without asking for credit, stayed until the work was done, and left before anyone could try to make her a symbol. The only time she spoke publicly again came at a small, untelevised event, a memorial gathering for Corporal Shauna Lee, a black female soldier who had died by suicide after being discharged and left unsupported. Clara stood beside Shauna's mother, arm around her shoulder, and said only 3 sentences. "We failed her. She gave everything and asked for nothing." That can never happen again. No cameras rolled, no microphones were present, but a young journalist in the crowd took notes and the words found their way into print. Weeks later, Congress passed the Lee-Whitmore Amendment, an expansion of post-discharge mental health access for minority servicewomen. Clara didn't even know about the bill until Celeste called her. "They put your name on it," she said. "I didn't ask for that," Clara replied. Celeste's voice cracked. "I know, that's why it matters." Meanwhile, Talia Brooks had become a quiet force of her own. After completing her service, she pursued a degree in law with support from the GI Bill and a small scholarship created in Clara's name. Talia didn't speak much about what had happened to her, but her presence in classrooms, and eventually courtrooms, carried its own weight. She didn't try to be the next Clara. She tried to be the first Talia, and that was enough. Years passed. Children born the year of Clara's stand began to grow up in a different landscape. Schools taught her case in government classes, not just for the drama of it, but for the truth in it. They studied how one woman's silence broke the noise of decades. College students wrote theses on stillness as resistance, the Whitmore model of testimony. Social justice programs used her example as a framework for speaking truth without violence, for leading without spectacle. One young man, a law student at Howard University, told an audience during a panel, "Clara Whitmore didn't resist the system with fury. She resisted it with presence. They tried to weaponize her dignity against her, and they failed." Every few years, someone would try to pull Clara back into the spotlight. An invitation to speak at a major university, a documentary crew asking for an interview, a national conference naming her a keynote speaker. She declined them all. But once a year, without fail, she returned to the courthouse. Not to speak, to sweep. She would arrive early in the morning with a simple broom. No one invited her. No one needed to. She swept the steps of the building where a gun had once been pointed at her head, a quiet act, a steady hand. When asked why she did it, Clara once told a local reporter, "Because it reminds me that the work is never done. And because I don't want anyone else to have to clean up alone." The Black Stone Monument remained in place and people still visited it. Tourists took photos, teachers brought students, activists left candles and flowers. It became a symbol not of suffering, but of standing, of surviving, of staying the course when everyone else hopes you'll falter. And in government offices far away, Clara's name kept showing up in legal briefings and community board minutes and federal transcripts. Even after she stopped speaking, her silence continued to speak for her. Back in Baltimore, on one particularly cold evening, Clara sat beside Celeste at their dining table. A storm knocked out the power. The two women lit candles, drank tea, and listened to the rain. "You know, Celeste said you changed more than you think." Clara looked at her daughter. "Did I?" "Yes," Celeste said, smiling. "You made silence impossible." Clara chuckled softly. "That wasn't my intention." "I know," Celeste replied. "That's what made it work." In the soft light, Clara's eyes reflected not pride but peace, not victory but responsibility, not the desire to be remembered, but the satisfaction of knowing she hadn't disappeared. What do we owe to those who stand still when the world is falling apart? That question has echoed across every chapter of this story. And now as we reach its end, it deserves to echo in your heart too. Clara Whitmore never wanted fame. She didn't seek the headlines. She didn't draft a speech. She didn't storm the courthouse, raise her fist, or beg for the spotlight. She walked in quietly, sat down, spoke when asked, and when a gun was drawn, when a man tried to erase her from the story, she didn't scream. She stood. That was all. And yet it changed everything. She showed us what dignity really looks like, not as something delicate, but as something forged under pressure, a steel backbone, a quiet presence, the ability to face hate with clarity, and to let truth do the talking. Clara's silence was not surrender. It was resistance. And now the question is, what will we do with that? Many of us, especially those in our 50s, 60s, and beyond, know what it's like to bite our tongues, to keep our heads down, to think it's not my place, or I've already done enough. Maybe you've seen injustice and didn't know how to respond. Maybe you stood by while someone else paid the price. Maybe like Clara once did, you walked away from something that didn't sit right but felt too big to fight. We all have our silences, but we don't have to carry them forever. Because what Clara taught us without preaching, without pleading, is that it is never too late to return, never too late to say, "I see it now. I hear it now. I will not be quiet anymore." Maybe you're a veteran like Clara. Maybe you're a teacher, a mother, a father. Maybe you're retired and wondering if your voice still matters in this noisy world. Maybe you're simply tired of yelling, of being ignored, of fighting battles that seem to regenerate overnight. But let me remind you of this. You don't have to shout to change something. You don't have to march to make noise. You don't have to go viral to be seen. You just have to show up with dignity, with truth, with conviction. That's what Clara did. And it shook the foundations of power. If her story moved, you ask yourself, where am I still needed? Because there's always a courthouse somewhere where someone is still scared to speak. There's always a young person wondering if they'll be believed. There's always a system waiting for someone to challenge it, not with rage, but with righteousness. Start small, but start. Call your local school board and ask what they're teaching students about protest and justice. Support a local veteran, especially those who don't look like what this country thinks a hero should look like. Attend a court proceeding. Just sit. Witness it. Let your presence be a reminder that the public is still watching. Talk to your children, your grandchildren. Tell them the truth. Tell them about Clara Whitmore, not as a symbol, but as a woman who chose to stand still and in doing so, move the country forward. Share this story with someone who thinks their voice doesn't matter. Remind them that a whisper in the right moment can sound like thunder. Let it be known that this generation, your generation, is still listening, still learning, still acting. Because you've seen what silence does, and you've seen what courage looks like. Let Clara's name live not just in legislation, but in legacy, in your choices, in your courage, in your daily resistance to the erosion of truth. And now, if this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of someone you know or maybe someone you once were, then don't let it end here. Talk about it. Come on. Like and share. Tell someone else about the woman who didn't flinch when a gun was pointed at her. Tell them about the letter from a young soldier, about the mother who stood up, about the crowd who stood still in her honor, about the system that shook because someone refused to play their game. Clara didn't want applause. She wanted a country where no one would have to do what she did again. We owe her that. And we owe it to ourselves to make that kind of courage contagious. So if you believe in the power of truth, if you believe that stillness can be a weapon and silence can be broken, then join us. Subscribe to the Black Women channel. Support stories that speak when others stay silent. Because Black women like Clara have always held the line. It's time we stand with them, not just when it's convenient, not just when it's trending, but always. Because justice doesn't retire. It doesn't age out. It doesn't wait for perfect timing. It just needs anyone to stand. So stand.